Welcome to Saturdays at the Stanley, Artists, Travelers, and Immigrants with Brady Plunger, Associate Curator of Education. Brady works with all of our audiences, but most closely with K-12 students and teachers with our Stanley School programs and the University of Iowa undergraduates with the Stanley Campus Council. Today's event is closed captioned. You can turn captions on by clicking on either the closed captioning icon or selecting Show Subtitles. We encourage you to comment using the chat function and ask questions using the Q&A button. I'll pass comments and questions on to Brady as he talks to keep the format as much of a discussion as possible. In Artists, Travelers, and Immigrants, Brady will discuss artists who are also immigrants like Hoffman and Lil Picard, reflecting on how the movement of people and ideas into, out of, and around the US created new possibilities for artists during the first half of the 20th century. Thanks for being with us today, Brady.
Thank you for having me. I always love these programs, and everything's, of course, still upside down for all of us in this world of COVID-19. But I also think this is an exciting opportunity because I know some of my loved ones, family and friends, have tuned in from around the country today. So I'm super excited that folks that might not be able to come visit us in Iowa City and see our collection in person can get a taste online. And Kim did such a wonderful job of laying out sort of the trajectory of my talk today, thinking about artists who were also immigrants and travelers, frankly. We're going to talk a lot about movement today, the movement of people, the movement of ideas, and sort of have an opportunity to think through where artists are in the world that offers them new possibilities and opportunities in their work and in their lives and in their careers to sort of become the figures that we encounter in museums when we see their works. And just to give a quick bit of background on this, where this idea sort of came from for me was actually working on K-12 materials for teachers to think about, because often I feel that sort of the artist's material and physical and geographic considerations may be left out when we think about their art, particularly when we think about encountering a work of art on a white wall in a gallery. And so I really like to think through how to incorporate that those stories and histories into the way that we look at their work. So we're gonna have a lot of opportunity to deep dive into 3 artists from our collection and sort of talk about where they were right around when they made the works of art that we're looking at. So we're kind of getting a hyper-focused biography today. One moment. There we go. So the first work and the first artist that we're going to talk about today is Edward Steichen, who is a photographer. As you can see, one of the interesting things you're going to see on all my slides is one of our sort of practices at the Stanley is we usually list a nationality next to our artists as well as their life dates, and you can see that kind of at the top of my slide. And in this case, we see American born in Luxembourg. And one of the themes you're going to see come up again and again in my talk is, how many American artists who, played a major role in shaping the visual arts and by extension, literature, film, even the growth and development of our museums and creative sector, just how many of them were born somewhere else. And came here at some point under varying circumstances. So starting with Edward Steichen, I love this work. It's a photogravure on mulberry paper. That's a type of photographic printing process that I'll actually talk a lot more about in a moment. But for now, I sort of want to just think a little bit about what this artwork is showing us. And I wonder, and you all can feel free to respond in the chat, and Kim will sort of keep me informed, how many of you might have thought when you first saw this work that it was a photographic print? because I know when I look at it, there's not a whole lot about it to me that screams photograph, right as we first look. You know, it has this kind of these intense variations of light and dark. There's a figure, but almost kind of shrouded in shadow, and you know everything is sort of blurry and very soft, and you know, not at all like we think of photography today, especially the types of images that we're sort of bombarded with online. You know, sort of up to the minute news photography, or you know, publicity shots from celebrities, things like that. Um, so we're going to talk more about this image in a moment, but I just kind of want you to think about it and notice some of the sort of, uh, if it does seem peculiar to you to think of this as a photograph, you know, sit with that and think about it a little bit and why this image might make you feel that way. So we're gonna kind of, I'm gonna fill you in a little bit on Edward's life here. So Steichen, as I mentioned before, was born in Luxembourg. His family immigrated to the United States actually when he was just about a year old. His parents brought the family, which at the time was his two parents and just him. His sister, who we see in this photograph, was not yet born, to Hancock, Michigan, of all places. So I know I've got some Yoopers in the audience. So there is your geographic shout out for the afternoon. The Steichens moved to Hancock, Michigan in 1880, and then a few years later moved to Milwaukee, which is where we see Edward spends most of his life growing up there. He goes to school there, and he actually leaves high school and becomes an apprentice at the American Photographic Company in Milwaukee and starts learning photographic printing processes. And this photo I love, and I was so excited to find this at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, is kind of a, you know, I think it's just so fascinating on so many levels. I mean, from the fashion, you know, they're dressed very of the moment for 1900. Edward, who we see on the left, kind of has almost a little bit of a smirk, you know, and sort of this very, you know, this very kind of intense gaze on the camera, with his head slightly tilted. And then, you know, his sister standing next to him is looking straight at us with the, you know, again, a very fashionably coiffed hat. And you know, this image is interesting too, because it's so very focused. You know, we just see their faces. We can barely make out any type of setting in the photograph. So we're really focused on the subjects, their clothing, their attitudes. And 1900 was an exciting year for Steichen. This was the year that he became an American citizen. This is the year that he, you know, signed his final naturalization paperwork and became, you know, truly, in the truest sense, a card-carrying American citizen. And you'll notice on the slide here, I labeled with his both the, you know, two spellings of his name. And I remember it feeling strange when I was looking at our materials at the Stanley, and I noticed his name was anglicized with the W for Edward, versus Eduard, which is the way that I had encountered his name spelled before. And so I did a little digging, and it turns out in 1900, when he signed his naturalization papers, he explicitly spelled his name the Anglo way, so with that W, although he continued to use the French spelling of his name, Eduard, until after the First World War. So there's kind of this interesting interplay you can think of, and we'll see it with several artists today, of, you know, how their names are spelled or how things are pronounced, and the way that evolves as they, you know, sort of settle in to their life in the United States. So Steichen becomes a citizen in 1900, and what does he do? heads straight to Europe. So he goes off to Paris, where he ends up rooming with another American abroad, Fred Holland. And actually on the left, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, but we see F. Holland taking a photograph of Steichen. In right around in 1901, they were sharing an apartment in Paris. They were attending exhibitions. They were both participating in the exhibitions at the Exposition Universelle, which was the sort of universal exposition in Paris and in London. And they were both sort of shown as examples of the new American school of photography and sort of holding their own right amongst the great European photographers. And I love having these two photos side by side. So on the left, we have F. Holland's portrait of Steichen, and on the right, we have the photogravure of Steichen's self-portrait that we sort of began with. And I love comparing these two images because they let us talk a lot about process. And also, I think, and we'll see a few more as we go through, show the great deal of fun that these two artists were having, as roommates in Paris at sort of one of the most exciting moments in 20th century European art history, as we're preparing to see the rise of Picasso and Matisse, the great art museums such as the Louvre are beginning to collect what at that time was contemporary art. So there's a real groundswell of excitement around the visual arts in Paris. And so you've got these two Americans, sort of living it up, having a great time. And if we look at the photograph on the left, I was so excited to find this because Steichen just looks like he's having fun, doesn't he? He's sort of, he's got this big old coat on and this hat, and he's, sort of a little bit cloaked in some shadow, just in the way that he is in the image on the right, his self-portrait, but at the same time, we do get a little more sense of fun. He's almost got a bit of a smirk on his face. His hat is a little bit askance, and he's just enjoying, this experimentation with different poses, with different photographic techniques. I'm sorry about that. I forgot to silence my phone, so I'll just throw it across the room. And this work on the left is a platinum print, which is a type of photographic print that uses platinum or palladium as a kind of agent. So the photograph actually sits directly on top of the paper that it's printed onto. So you get these really sharp, clean contrasts. Even though in the photograph we see a lot of shadow, there's also a sense that we can see elements of the background, we can see elements of the hallway, of the kickboards along the floor and everything. Whereas when we look at the Steichen self-portrait on the right, we're really seeing a lot more, it's much more sort of dark and shadowy. And that's because photogravure is a type of process that actually involves a number of more steps and actually takes some cues directly from printmaking. So using copper plates, the artist will take the photographic negative and they'll actually turn it into what's called a film positive. So they'll reverse those areas of light and dark. If you're, if anyone out there is familiar with film anymore, you could probably remember what a film negative looks like. And creating a film positive is sort of just reversing those light effects. And then you place this image, this film positive that you've created in a bath with a copper plate, and the photographer will use etching tools, so printmaking tools, to incise different lines, to create different textures. And then ultimately, after that plate and that positive have sat in that bichromate bath, they're taken out, and then the plate can be inked and run through a press, just like a print. And that's how we get all these wonderful sort of areas of light and dark and this beautiful kind of shadowy texture. I did want to show one image of Steichen, or image taken by Steichen of his roomie, Fred Holland, taken around the same time, 1900, 1901, but printed as a photogravure in 1906 for a special issue of the magazine Camera Work, which was dedicated to Steichen's work. And again, I share this image just to, give a sense of the sort of, even though it's, sort of very grave and serious, this is really, two artists having a good time and, thinking about, expressing different attitudes, exploring different poses, and really playing with these very advanced photographic techniques. They're using photogravure, they're using that platinum print process that I mentioned. And really Paris is the heart of the sort of advances in photography at this time. So Steichen, coming from America, is getting to learn from the very best practitioners with the very latest technologies as he's sort of, getting into this. And he and Holland were both active with the Photo Club de Paris. And, so they were not only celebrated in exhibitions and things like that, but they were very much active in the Paris photographic community. And I want to talk just a little more about Steichen's image. And to do that, I've pulled up a painting here. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to pull up something else on my other screen so that I can give you the quote that goes along with this. But this is a painting by the Italian Renaissance painter Titian from 1520, and it's Man with Glove, which is at the Louvre, and would have been a work that Steichen likely would have been able to see when he was in Paris. And I wonder, as we look at these two images, there are some definite, I think, some very strong kind of connections that we can draw between them, strong sort of correspondences, I guess I'll say. We see two young men sort of, well dressed with fashionable haircuts, elegant clothing. The Titian portrait, has a great deal of shadow. I mean, we're really just presented with the sitter and sort of the suggestion of some furniture, but really no other background. So we really get to focus on this young man and his stylish clothing and this sort of elegant pose. And that's sort of the direction Steichen is going as well. And we have a quote from his diary when he took this photograph. He said, quote, "I dressed up in one of Day's stocks, that is a long white scarf, and draped his mantle around my shoulders, picked up a palette and brush, and posed in the mirror for what I thought was going to be photography's answer to Titian's Man with Glove." So indeed, Steichen was thinking exactly of this painting and was eager to sort of rise to the challenge that Titian, as one of the great Renaissance painters, posed to the artists of the present day. And one important thing to sort of keep in mind with art in this moment in the early 20th century is photography, painting, sculpture, all of these arts that were sort of, being practiced, were always being compared in the European context to the Renaissance. And so there was many artists felt sort of, in some ways that they had to directly take on the challenge of those Renaissance artists. And, so just to finish up with Steichen here, he, shortly after these photographs were taken, he returned to New York. He begins working with Alfred Stieglitz at the Photo Secession Gallery and begins having input on the Camera Work magazine. And then really sort of his career takes off. He photographs the Condé Nasts, he photographs Charlie Chaplin. Um, Steichen basically, makes his stock and trade, elegant portraits of society people. And I didn't bring any of those images in, but looking back at this image really quick from 1901, we can just really appreciate, this is where, this is what Steichen sort of became known for and could sort of build his reputation on. And he was very eager to sort of show how photography could be like painting, which was considered at that time the sort of art of all arts, the most ingenious, the most inventive. And so there was, again, that idea of he really needed to pick up the challenge. And he had this extra pressure being an American in Europe and needing to sort of stake his claim and stake a claim for American artists. So now we're going to kind of jump ahead, actually, and we're going to talk about Lil Picard, who was sort of a woman of all trades in every sense. She was a cabaret dancer, she was a journalist, she was an artist, she was a fashion designer, and sort of is called by many the grandmother of the avant-garde. And this Picard work from 1947, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about it because it might, on first glance, appear relatively simple. It's sort of a large, sort of semi-square, rectangular canvas. We can see a lot of sort of differing paint colors, sort of, we might even use the word sloppily applied, very roughly applied. But as we start to look closer, there's so many areas of interesting texture. And I'm going to see, I think my mouse is visible to all of you. Like right here, we see this kind of ribbing. And here we see something kind of rising up out of the surface that almost seems like wire. And there's more of that ribbing here. We see areas where like this sort of patterning comes through. It might be hard to recognize on this slide, but that's actually houndstooth fabric. And there's other areas where we can see sort of the brown fabric of the canvas showing through. So Lil Picard in 1947, had been living in the United States for about a decade and was really plugged in to the most advanced sort of arts and design and fashion circles in our country. She was, and I'm gonna advance the slide here, we'll come back to that. And she sort of, to sort of back up though, she was, as I mentioned, she came from Germany. She was born in Landau in 1899 and made a name for herself first in Vienna as a cabaret dancer and then in Berlin, where she also took up journalism and visual art. She was practicing collage and a number of other art forms and sort of just being seen in the avant-garde circles of Berlin in the 20s and 30s. And here we see her pictured with her, with her dog in front of the Hotel Aldon, which was the sort of hangout for the hip young art crowd in Berlin. And, it's this wonderful moment if we focus on her for a moment of she's sort of holding a treat, getting the dog to jump on its hind legs. She's dressed very fashionably for a woman of the 1930s in this sort of fur trimmed coat. She's got her little, she has a hat that's sort of, again, set at that askance angle. But then there's something more unsettling here. And of course, if we just look up from her, we see a banner hanging from the side of this building, and emblazoned on that banner is a swastika, because of course in the 1930s we were seeing the rise of Hitler's National Socialist Party in Germany. And this photo, I think, is so particularly stunning and sort of stops you in your tracks when you get to know that Lil Picard was a Jewish woman, and she had, she came from, a long distinguished heritage of Jewish people in Germany. And so to imagine being, this young woman, fashionable, sort of at the height of your, your career, having a great time in the clubs and cabarets, and then you walk outside and you're sort of confronted with this symbol of hatred, really, and confronted by the emblem of a government that is fundamentally opposed to you even existing. And this is the sort of backdrop that we need to keep in mind, because Picard in 1937 would flee Germany with her husband. And I think there's no better word for it than flee, because the National Socialist government revoked her press credentials. And she saw that action as sort of, foreshadowing what the future might bring for her. So she and her husband boarded an ocean liner in 1937 and headed for New York. And this photograph is another one of those ones that I was so excited to find in our archives, because, oftentimes we talk about artists being travelers and immigrants. We talk about these sort of details of their lives, but rarely do we have a photograph that, so perfectly and encapsulates that moment. I mean, this was literally taken on the boat by Henry Odell, and we see Picard looking out at the Statue of Liberty, and to think, what, how many times have any of us seen this image in movies or in museums, or in textbooks, if we think back to our time in school. And to have this moment of, and someone sort of standing in that transitional moment, she's still out on the boat, she's hasn't stepped onto American soil yet, and sort of gazing out at Lady Liberty and thinking about what that means. And I keep saying this, but this was one of those photographs that stopped me in my tracks. And I said, wow, this is something that, it's almost as if it were tailor-made for my talk this afternoon. So Picard arrives in New York in 1937. She sets up shop, first in her own custom hat shop on Manhattan's Madison Avenue. And we have some wonderful archival items from the University of Iowa Special Collections and the Lil Picard papers that tell us, she made a splash right away. And I think if we start on the right and just look at this, this elegant ad from Mademoiselle magazine of a woman wearing a Lil Picard hat. And I love this hat because, to me, it seems, and I think for many of us looking at this today in 2020, it's rather shocking and kind of rather surprising. And it doesn't, that's not something that we think that someone might wear in any facet of regular life. But there was a real moment in the 20s, 30s, and 40s when visual artists, particularly surrealists and Dada artists, were really making sort of waves and creating new connections with fashion designers. And Lil Picard was part of the Dada circle in Vienna and in Berlin. She knew Hugo Ball and Georges Gros and many, many others. And so she is like picking up on this surrealist idea, these sort of uncanny things, uncanny juxtapositions. So we have sort of this bird and what looks like a branch and sort of a little almost arrangement of flowers, sort of perched on this woman's head on her very, stylish hairstyle. And then she has this very shaped sort of architectural gown that we see just the top of. And I love these, particularly this headline from November of 1939, "Fabric Verve in Models Designed by New Milliners." And it's sort of this, fashion correspondent talking about the sort of energy and creativity that Lil Picard is bringing to the, Manhattan fashion scene. And specifically in this article, they sort of draw a line between her arriving in America and the possibilities, the creative and artistic possibilities that America provides to her. When they talk about America is a great stimulant for creative work, and she praises the enthusiasm of the art galleries to show the latest art, which was especially something that was not happening in Berlin at this time, because the Nazis had clamped down on modern and contemporary art and were amassing art and either sort of stowing it away or destroying it. So here are just a few more ads. These were sort of just really exciting to me when I came across them. Lil, first she had her own boutique called D Lil, where not only did she design hats, but she designed jewelry and lingerie. And then eventually she was invited to set up a hat boutique within Bloomingdale's department store, the Custom Hat Box, which sort of earned her another sort of level of praise and visibility in the New York scene. And I particularly love on the left that sort of piano key hat, or the one next to it with the what I decided were maybe lips, but I could be completely wrong on that. Or looking below to the hat with sort of the eye with the almost sunburst pattern around it. And these are all direct references to visual art, to painting, to surrealism, and the uncanny, the juxtapositions that are meant to sort of catch you and shock you and discomfort you and sort of make you reconsider, what you're seeing, and almost as if maybe your eyes are playing a trick on you or something like that. So Lil Picard, and has a great deal of overlap with actually the next artist we're going to talk about in a moment, Hans Hofmann. And she attended his School of Fine Arts in Provincetown, Massachusetts in 1938 or 39. She probably went back and forth. And from Hoffman, she was literally kind of learning getting the pulse of the latest developments in painting. Particularly, Hoffman was very much enchanted with color, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But Hoffman had created this sort of art colony almost in Provincetown, where nearly every American modernist would sort of come at some point, whether it be Joan Mitchell or Franz Klein, and sort of created this space for artists to connect. And I love these photos because there's these casual moments of artists sort of in nature, outdoors, having opportunities to sort of experiment and think about their work. Because often I think now we think of art school as something that's very rigid and very defined, and I'm sure many art students can tell you that is not true, especially in these times. But I think these photos help us think about sort of the opportunities that were, artists were social. They weren't just locked in their studios alone creating work. They were engaging with each other. They were engaging with professionals in other sort of areas, whether it be fashion or architecture, or journalism and art criticism. So there was really, and all these things were created by the increased opportunities and increased mobility that the 20th century brought, with networks of trains to take people in and out of New York City very easily. The early half of the 20th century was the moment for ocean liners, right? When we saw all of these massive ships setting these sort of mind-bending, at the time, records of getting across the Atlantic from New York to Southampton in 5 days or 4.5 days. Um, so there was a level of connectivity that there had never been before. And so artists were able to move around and engage with each other, and find new possibilities. So coming back to Picard's work Crossing from 1947, I just want to say a little bit more about some of this texture that I pointed out, some of these areas where we definitely have sort of materials intruding almost on the painting, on the traditional oil painting, um, that are not traditional fine art materials. Like these ribs actually come from corrugated cardboard. There's wire down here. There's, you know, bits of paper and other ephemera, you know, kind of just little bits of tickets and different things from everyday life that Picard gathered and sort of built into this abstract painting. And I love this painting because I think in so many ways it sums up the whole talk, in that what I'm sort of presenting is the idea that artworks are sort of accretions. They're buildup of artists' experiences, of their movements, of their ideas, of their emotions. And in particular, this painting is kind of wonderful because a lot of these materials come from Picard's just everyday sort of traversing of Manhattan, things she gathered, you know, on the street, as she was going about her daily life. And so in many ways, it's a sort of recognition of her movements around New York and the idea of sort of, you know, capturing or indexing her daily life. But that title, Crossing, has made us art historians out here in the world think that, you know, she's also maybe in 1947 reflecting back on her first crossing of the Atlantic to the United States in 1937, and sort of what that meant for her as an artist and as an individual. And actually by 47, Picard was, you know, crisscrossing the Atlantic regularly. She was a correspondent for a number of German language publications. So she was really, you know, going back and forth between Europe and America, meeting with artists, meeting with other creative people, and sort of herself, you know, being almost a platform of communication between the avant-garde on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think, you know, this painting is just wonderful because it's past and present. It's, you know, sort of immediate present in thinking about her daily life, but also her present in 1947 as this traveler between New York and Europe, and then also thinking back to her, you know, this sort of this moment of seeking refuge in the United States from the Nazi regime in 1937. So I know we sort of broached on Hans Hofmann a moment before when we saw those pictures of Lil Picard at his School of Fine Arts in Provincetown. And so now I actually want to turn to Hoffman himself, who was another American artist who is, you know, widely considered, always classified by American and, you know, art historians of all stripes as an American artist. Yet he didn't come to the United States, you know, until he was in his 60s. He was born in Germany, sort of hit his career stride in Munich in the teens and 20s as an instructor of art. And we'll sort of dive more into that, but I want to just spend a moment with this painting, because I think there's so much in here that talks about where Hoffman was at in 1953. And I'm sure, you know, many of you can relate. I know I feel this when I look at this work. It's when I was first writing about it, I was honestly kind of bewildered. I was disoriented. I wasn't sure exactly what I was looking at. I thought maybe we were looking, as I looked at it and saw these sort of red forms here and here. I thought maybe we were almost looking at a drafting table that would have had, sort of writing implements and things on it, where the artist might do sketches or, small watercolor drawings or sort of quick paintings. But in taking more time to look at it, I, came to realize that what we have here is a tabletop, sort of on an oblique angle, so sort of lifted up and pointed at us, with sort of a deconstructed um, uh, vase of flowers, and then over here we have a window looking to the outside, and then here is the sort of titular red cap. Um, and what I love about this image is it's such a departure from the other two, in that it's these bright, vibrant oil paints, on a canvas. It really sort of, wakes you up after you might have been getting a little tired of all my black and white photos and such. And we'll delve more into the work in a moment. But I want to talk about Hoffman, a little more about his life. So you see again on the left, I'm showing that same photo from Provincetown in 1938. And then on the right, I'm showing a photo of Hoffman in his garden. And I brought these two photos together because they're so, sort of bright, and, even though they're black and white, you really get a sense of the light and of the sort of energy of Hoffman's School of Fine Arts and of the man himself. And I love the photo of him in his garden, because he has this sort of big grin. He's almost laughing, as he's sort of out surrounded by nature. And this is really, this is Hoffman. I mean, he had such a zest and a verve for life, and was such a believer in the sort of healing power of art, and the expressive power of art, and especially of color and light. And actually, Hoffman, oftentimes when people sort of talk about Hoffman's biography, they say he immigrated to the United States in 1931. But that's actually not true. Throughout the 30s, he traveled back and forth between the United States and Germany, teaching classes at the University of California and a number of other universities in the United States. And really, it was not until the late 30s that he, applied for and was granted citizenship. And it really took a lot of pressure from his wife, Maria, who we see in the photo kind of at the right there, standing with Hoffman, whose back is to us, and then Samuel Coots, who was an art critic. And it really took his wife sort of goading him to make sure that he finalized his, there are letters between the two of them where she's sort of insisting that he, quote unquote, finalize his relationship with the United States of America, because they were both, intimately aware and very concerned, as Lil Picard and as the whole world was, frankly, at the rapid advance of fascism in Germany. And Hoffman's wife actually would come over separately from him, and each of them sort of had interesting journeys, because Hoffman was able to leverage connections with universities and sort of arts professionals, and he was able to lean on his practice as an educator to sort of help make the case for why he needed to be brought over to the US, or sort of given that permanent citizenship to protect him from being recalled back to Germany, because that was a very real fear. The German government was very open about sort of calling its citizens back in this period. And his wife had a sort of different path. And actually, for Maria, she ended up working very closely with a family out of New Orleans, who sponsored her visa and brought her over. And so for her first few years in America in the late 30s, she was actually living in New Orleans, which I just thought was sort of a fabulous, another geographic sort of puzzle to rework. You've got Hoffman up in Massachusetts and in New York, and then you've got his wife down in Louisiana. Couldn't be more different. And just sort of this really fascinating interplay. And I threw in this photo at the left of Hoffman painting on the dunes because I just, again, I love the energy of it. And I love, you know, he's got this big smile on his face. He's out of doors. He's doing really what he loves best in this place that he loves best, and that he's able to sort of foster this environment of bringing people together around art, and specifically around this sort of growing expressionist movement that we come to call as abstract expressionism. So to finish up with this painting, in 1953, you know, Hoffman was already an elder statesman of American art. You know, he had, you know, among his students, Lee Krasner, who was a fantastic artist in her own right, but also known as the wife of Jackson Pollock, who was also kind of his manager and impresario and bully when she needed to be to advance his career. But also Joan Mitchell, Franz Klein, you know, nearly everyone at some point visited Hans Hofmann's School of Fine Arts. Nearly every 20th century sort of modern painter. And so coming back to this image, you know, especially if we think back to that photo we saw of Hoffman in his garden, or the picture of Hoffman in his, you know, painting on the dunes, we really get that energy and that brightness that he was feeling in Provincetown with this, you know, with these unmixed colors. So these are just straight out of the tube oil paints. So that's why they have sort of that intense color to them. They haven't been mixed with anything. He's not making hues or shades. He's just taking it straight out of the tube. He's painting very freely, very openly, trying to sort of capture the, you know, the energies and the movement of light, you know, through this window from this Provincetown landscape. And I have just a little quotation that I want to share because I'm a dutiful art historian and I always have quotations to share. But Hoffman said, "The whole of the world as we experience it visually comes to us through the mystic realm of color." So he's really committed to the expressive power of color and to what color can do to enhance our experience of visual art and of more generally the world around us. And finally, just one more little quotation. Hoffman said, "Painting means forming with color. The color development produces the form of the composition." And looking at this painting, I mean, there's no clearer example. We see very little, you know, line work, very little drawing. It's all, the forms are created through the brushwork, through the physical application of the color to the canvas. And, you know, for Hoffman, you know, he was sort of enabled and able to create these large paintings by the network of galleries and museums and arts professionals that he had on both sides of the Atlantic. And, you know, he was furnished with a type of stability and openness of instruction and freedom of expression in the United States that allowed him to really, you know, sort of flourish and to have all of this sort of impact on so many artists' careers. You know, although sometimes some artists would like Lee Krasner and Joan Mitchell would sort of explain that they only went to one or two of Hoffman's classes because they couldn't really understand what he was saying most of the time. You know, so there's all these sort of humorous moments of artists interacting and sort of almost bouncing off each other like atoms, you know, and creating these ripples of, you know, new possibilities through the work that they're making, through the ideas that they're sharing, and through the places that they are. So I want to leave it there for some Q&A. So Kim, let's go ahead and fire that up and see what folks have to say. And I want to thank you all for going on that journey with me. This talk was a lot of fun to put together, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks, Brady, for that really fascinating talk. Let's see. We'll have, if you have questions or comments, you can put those in the chat or in the Q&A. I've got both open and can see them, and I'll pose those to Brady. I'll kick us off by asking you something that struck me about these artists. They all seem to not only travel to the US, but within the US and back and forth. So it wasn't just one major immigration or one major travel experience that seems to have influenced them, but just the accumulation of their travels seemed to infiltrate into their work and affect their development as artists. Can you talk a little bit more about that and maybe how that fits with some other artists maybe that you hadn't been able to cover today?
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question. And thank you. I was kind of groping for the term accumulation earlier and I didn't quite get there. So thank you for that. Um, because it really, the history of 20th century art in the United States is the history of people moving around. We have a great Stuart Davis painting in our collection, for example, New York to Paris. That is not only a painting about Davis's frequent travels between the US and Europe, but also includes elements like the elevated train track from New York City and the schooners that he would have taken pleasure sails on in Massachusetts when he was out there for the summer. It really the history of 20th century art, it's just that. It's artists moving, taking advantage of all these technologies, whether it be cars or trains or I sort of mentioned some of those world record setting ocean liners earlier. Flight also starts to play an interesting role. We have a work in our collection by Alfred Stieglitz, who was a friend and co-conspirator of Edward Steichen. And it's a Stieglitz photograph of a dirigible, which of course dirigibles were one of the first types of manned aircraft that were steerable and drivable, and had sort of complex systems for maneuvering. And this opened up a whole new world of perspectives, and suddenly artists could think about the world from above or the world from below. One often overlooked sort of technological marvel in New York City that affected a lot of artists was Grand Central Station. When Grand Central Station opened in Manhattan, it was the most advanced and complex rail station anywhere. I mean, it had multiple levels of underground tracks moving at, over and above each other. It had, multiple sort of this very complex inner alignment of spaces to move people through, to move them between, you might come in on a subway train at the lowest level and then have to go up 1 or 2 levels to get onto your train that's going to take you to Connecticut or to Massachusetts. And just thinking about that movement in space was really transformative for artists. And there was actually, I can geek out just a little bit about the Grand Central Station thing, because there was an article, I want to say it was Popular Science, where they sort of featured these diagrams of the movement of or the sort of diagrammatic plans of Grand Central Station. And in so many ways, that was artists were already thinking about movement and how people move on multiple levels, whether it be the levels of a building or the levels of flight versus ground travel. And they were also sort of thinking about the supernatural and the spiritual and how those are different levels of reality that are all sort of full of energy, that are all moving in different directions. So really, there's so many moments. And even to fast forward to contemporary art, to the artist Julie Meritou, who is known very well for painting sort of these abstract compositions of airport terminals. And her work so exemplifies this idea of people moving on multiple levels, energies flowing in many directions at once, as she's trying to sort of capture the vibrancy of and movements of an airport terminal in a single painting. So it really can't be overstated how these how movement and the improvement of transportation technologies, as well as other technologies like telegraphs and telephones and radios and film, which is something Lauren Lessing, our director, and I will be talking about tonight at our live drive-in event. But all of these things sort of gave artists just whole new ways of thinking about the world around them and thinking about how to represent the world around them in a way that would be relevant and would speak to the time that they're in and to their experiences. So that was a really long answer, but I can't help but geek out about the train station thing, because that was, for me as a graduate student, that was something really interesting that I had never thought of before, because I've been to Grand Central Station and it never occurred to me to think about how complex the engineering of that structure is.
Yeah, it is really interesting to think about not only architecture, but how these different views from looking down on the sky, how views from boats were able to also kind of transform and help artists reimagine how to see the world or approach it from different angles that weren't possible before.
Mm-hmm.
The other question I have for you is about materiality. With the Lil Picard, you talked a little bit about the cardboard that she included in the painting. Did you notice, as you were studying these artists or any others in our collection, have you noticed differences or shifts in the kinds of materials that artists used while they were traveling or after they moved somewhere?
Oh, absolutely. And that's another, that's some of the specificity that I think we sometimes lose, when we talk about art history in broad terms in our textbooks, or in, even in our galleries, is, sometimes artists are encountering new materials, or techniques for the very first time in another place, and particularly in, really the early and mid 20th century, you still had to travel to find these things. We didn't, the internet and even television, didn't exist yet. So to see these things and to see them in action, you had to go there. And I think, when I talked about Steichen, I mean, all those complex print processes that he learned, the platinum printing process, the photogravure process, I mean, he learned, and had exposure to the best practitioners, but also the latest materials and technologies, because of course, photography is a chemical process. I mean, the exposing of a negative and the printing of a photograph involve, numerous chemical compounds and different technical technical, machinery, equipment, that you would, that you might have to, like, only one person in the world might have the right kind of, the right kind of apparatus to submerge a photogravure plate in its bichromate bath, or two artists might have developed two different ones, and one might be better than the other. And even thinking about the works, like using Steichen again as an example, those photogravures that were printed later. So they were printed in the United States, but they were printed on very high quality paper. That mulberry paper is, at the time, was, some of the best, most high quality paper that an artist could hope to have their photographs printed on. And that was done very specifically by Alfred Stieglitz, because he wanted these works to be able to be taken out of the magazine and displayed in one's home as, as a work of art in itself. So these artists really, it's because they traveled, it's because they moved around, that they had access to these materials, and particularly, even for Hoffman at mid-century, having access to large quality canvases and quality paints. Like New York was the epicenter of art materials, and he had access to things in a much easier, more sort of bountiful way than many artists in Europe did, as they dealt with the sort of, the scarcities and rationing after World War II. So any way you look at it, I mean, where an artist is located, plays a great impact on the types of materials, as well as the techniques and even the ideas that they sort of get to delve into.
Thank you, Brady. This was a fantastic talk. It was really engaging and intriguing to learn about these artists, the way that they moved, the works that they created, and the really complex and rich lives that they had and they shared through their artwork.